Well, good morning. What a great set of speakers and panels so far, and I'm really happy to be a part of National Clean Energy Week this year. And I have an excellent panel this morning to offer to you. I'm really excited to hop into it because it's all about clean energy and what it means to the US economy. And I'm actually going to read the title of it because I found it just the right pitch. So, technology leadership, American-made solutions for the world. So that gets me up in the morning. So great job on whoever came up with that. We are going to talk today about the United States' comparative advantage in clean energy sectors and discuss the conditions needed to accelerate that and continue with the strong job growth that we've had across our industries. We're also going to talk a little bit about how states and the national governments are playing a role, and also what we can see in terms of the geopolitical relationships. How is what's happening here influencing other countries and their deployment of clean energy and their economic development. So what I'd first like to do is introduce our panelists to you. We have, right to my left, Michael Caldarera, Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Technical Services for the National Propane Gas Association. Next to him, we have Malcolm Woolf, CEO and President of the National Hydropower Association. Then we have Framme, Government Relations and Communications Manager at Orsted. And then finally, we have Michael Cohen, who is the Chief U.S. Economist for BP and also Head Analysis in the Oil Division. So wonderful to have you. I dare say I'm going to offer a few kind of general trends that we've seen in the U.S. energy marketplace, but I've got the chief economist for BP here, so he will certainly fill in and add to anything that I've missed, I'm sure. But, as we think about what clean energy sectors mean to the U.S. economy, I wanted to share a few key facts from the 2019 Sustainable Energy in America Fact Book. Charles was, generous enough to mention it earlier. It's an excellent resource to provide a real 101 on what's going on in the U.S. energy marketplace. It's commissioned by the Business Council and its members and independently produced each year by Bloomberg New Energy Finance, so check it out. But let's talk about U.S. competitiveness and jobs, pointing to some of the things we highlighted in the fact book. Number one, the U.S. energy productivity has grown by 14% in the last decade. So that's the amount of energy used for GDP growth. That is a remarkable short-term trend, and when you back it out even further, it's even a higher increase. In terms of investment, the U.S. economy has $64 billion of investment in clean energy sectors, and that's an 11% gain year on year from 2017 to 2018. In terms of jobs, clean energy industries conservatively provide over 3.5 million jobs throughout the country. We're going to hear more about how the industries represented on the panel look at workforce issues and basically the faces of the employees from their industries. Very exciting. And the U.S. outcompetes most of its competitors internationally in terms of energy prices. And then I think one of the really exciting things that we highlighted in the past couple of years in terms of exports of U.S. technologies, we are a global leader in terms of technology innovation and exports. If you look at natural gas, if you look at energy efficiency, if you look at renewable energy, and then there are many emerging technologies where we have a strong comparative advantage, whether that be in sustainable transportation or storage. So I hope this panel will explore these topics, and I look forward to hearing from each one of you. I think what we'll do is we'll start with just some further introductions and maybe share a little bit of some of the key points that you'd like to discuss in the panel. And Mike, we'll start with you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Let me just give a little bit of background on our association. So, National Propane Gas Association. We are the national association for the propane industry. We're headquartered here in Washington, D.C. We have about 2,600 total members. Of those members, about 2,200 are what we call retail propane marketers who actually sell the fuel to the end user. Propane itself is produced as a byproduct primarily of natural gas liquids processing. It is delivered via an established infrastructure, over-the-road trucking, through rail and through pipelines. Really, in recent years, with the shale revolution in the supply of shale gas, the supply of propane has increased markedly to the point where the U.S. is now a net exporter of propane as of about 2012. And so prior to that, our industry was always focused on had a domestic view of the industry, but now we're playing, obviously, now in a global market. Many people think of propane as just simply the backyard barbecue fuel for your grill, but there are many applications of the fuel. It's used for space heating, water heating, agricultural crop drying, as a vehicle fuel, both for on-road and off-road vehicles, as backup power for portable generators and stationary generators as well. And it's used in combined heat and power applications as well. We're really, it's a portable fuel. We are in locations where typically the natural gas infrastructure is not. We are present pretty much in every county, with some exceptions, in the United States. The ICF has done a study and said that the propane industry has generated a direct impact of $46 billion on the U.S. economy. So those are some of the aspects. From an environmental standpoint, propane, we like to say, is clean and green. It is designated as an alternative fuel in the Clean Air Act. Propane is not a greenhouse gas, and it's not a groundwater contaminant. So we think the low carbon nature of the fuel itself, and the fact that we're not a greenhouse gas, positions us well to be a carbon fighting tool as we look towards more a low carbon energy future. And not only just the traditional propane, but we're also excited about the prospects of renewable propane as well, which is being produced today. So, and the applications that we have there. So, be happy to talk more about that in a little bit. So,
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Malcolm.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to everyone. Good morning. This is my third year participating in National Clean Energy Week, so hats off to Heather and Charles and the entire team for putting this together. I think it's a wonderful event. It's my first time, however, participating in my new role as President and CEO of National Hydropower. So in just a few minutes, I wanted to share 4 quick takeaways that I'd like to leave you about hydro and how it fits in to the growing transformation of the electricity system. So first and foremost, hydro is an essential part of the U.S. electricity system. We're 7% of U.S. generation currently, providing power to about 30 million Americans. We're also 39% of U.S. renewable generation currently. So we like to call ourselves America's first renewable resource. The second point I want to leave you with is that we believe hydro is an essential part of any climate solution. In fact, we think we're a force multiplier. Not only is hydro a carbon-free resource, but we think because of its flexibility, because it can ramp up and down so quickly, it's actually essential to enabling deeper penetration of wind and solar on the grid and allowing for a reliable grid with more renewables. So we think we're a force multiplier that's an essential part of a climate solution. My third point, and after decades in the industry, this wasn't obvious to me, frankly, until I started exploring this position, which is that hydro is not tapped out. The Department of Energy did a Hydro Vision report a couple years ago that found that there was the potential for 50 gigawatts of new hydro in America without any more dams. So we're not talking about kind of Hoover Dam era construction. We're talking about repowering existing dams. We're talking about putting power generation in the 97% of existing dams that don't have power generation. So let me just say that again, because it took me a couple times before I realized 97% of US dams don't generate power. They're there for flood control, they're for irrigation, for recreation, lots of purposes. Without building new dams, we can tap that resource and generate power. Small hydro, run-of-river hydro has had a lot of technical advances, ocean energy, marine energy, tidal energy, wave energy. They're all exciting new areas of promise. If we tap into them, we can create jobs, we can export this technology. It could be a huge win-win in terms of clean energy resources, which is really my final point as a job creator. There's 66,000 US employees currently working in the hydro sector. We think that can grow. We think it can grow domestically here as well as exports, but that's not currently the trajectory. It is very, very hard to get new hydro built in this country. Increasingly, manufacturing is going overseas, and we're losing out on the exports. They're still tapping our engineers, our consultants. They're all over the world, but we're missing an opportunity. So I'd love the opportunity, Lisa, to talk more about barriers and opportunities for growth.
Great, thank you so much. Hayes.
Great. Well, thank you for allowing me to be here today. I'm Hayes Framme. I am with Orsted. We're the largest offshore wind developer in the world. We're a Danish-based company. We have invested heavily in the U.S. market and see it as a long-term growth opportunity for us and for the offshore wind industry more broadly. A couple of the resources up here are things that are well established in the U.S. Offshore wind is a little more in its infancy in terms of the U.S. market, albeit very mature in Europe. And so there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of the things that have been talked about now in terms of jobs, job growth, capital investment is really here. But maybe I'll start just a little bit with why the U.S., given that offshore wind is expanding globally. There are kind of three main factors that make the U.S. very attractive to the offshore wind industry. First, it has good wind resource, which is kind of the most important thing. But off the East Coast, there are very good wind resources, especially in the Northeast. You have some comparable with some of the best resources in Europe. The second, it is a relatively shallow outer continental shelf off the East Coast, and so you can go pretty far out to capture more of that resource more consistently and still stay shallow enough to be able to actually have in-ground foundations. And then the third, and when we talk about a clean energy transition, I think this is particularly poignant, is it's close to major load centers. And with the challenges of building out transmission infrastructure into those urban areas, especially in the Northeast, having a new untapped, not new, but an untapped resource off the coast that can plug and play right into where a lot of that consumption is taking place is a real advantage. And so it creates a lot of potential. And so that's why the U.S. More broadly is a really attractive market for the offshore wind industry. With it being in its infancy, a lot of opportunity comes in attracting a mature supply chain to a new market. And that's where the jobs and capital investment piece come in. Obviously, as developers like Orsted, we are bringing our own resources to bear as we bid on and then deploy, execute, and install these wind farms. But you also have that supply chain, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. If they see a consistent pipeline of megawatts for the medium and long term, they're going to start thinking about making those investments in the U.S. In areas that over the last couple of decades have seen economic distress, certain port areas in the Northeast, and other areas that are looking for greater economic diversification, that may be port cities that have been reliant on cargo container volume, looking to diversify their portfolio, and offshore wind presents a lot of that opportunity. The last piece, and this ties directly back into the title of this, which is innovation. While we are somewhat of a lag in terms of maturation of the industry and we'll learn a lot from Europe, there are a lot of opportunities, a lot of enthusiasm around offshore wind that position the U.S. to potentially create a lot of the innovation for next level deployment, next generation deployment of offshore wind resources. So look forward to talking about that as well.
Great, thank you. Michael.
So I'm going to just try to talk a little bit about some of the broader landscape here as BP looks out into the future, out to 2040 in our energy outlook. There are a couple key takeaways that I wanted to share with you that maybe can give some context here. But before I look out into the future, there is one key takeaway just looking at what happened in 2018 that I think is important for all of you, and that is that we are not on a sustainable path. Last year we saw one of the highest rates of growth in carbon emissions that we've seen in several years, so upwards of 2%. Much of that came from extreme weather events and also a rebound in the Chinese economy. So that's not a good story. So as we're looking forward, we have this dual challenge. So over the next 20 to 30 years, 80% of the population right now uses less than 100 gigajoules a day of energy. And that's going to change over the course of time. Something like 60 to 65% over the time from now to 2040 will use that little bit of power and energy. But it's important to understand that how that evolves really determines what the energy system will look like from now until 2040. So right now, we're not moving in the right direction. We need to move faster, and we need to decarbonize faster, and there's a whole host of different fuels that are going to play a role, an important role in that mix. I think the other important thing to understand over the course of time is that there is this need for more energy, and without more energy, you cannot deliver increasing prosperity to the developing world. So it's important to understand that whilst there may be some solutions that may work in the industrialized world, they may not be appropriate in the developing world. Every single country is going to have their own set of solutions, their own set of fuels, given their respective mix that will make a decarbonized picture more palatable in the longer term. So I think the second point I want to make is that in order to decarbonize faster, it's important to focus very much on the power sector. So natural gas plays a very important role here. And one of the key points that I would make just over the course of the last 3 years is that if we had wanted to keep carbon emissions constant, we would have had to have seen upwards of 1,000 terawatt hours more renewable energy generation added in that same 3-year time period in order to keep carbon emissions flat. Or we could have switched 10% of current coal-fired generation on a global basis to natural gas and achieved the same result for less cost. So this is not to say that we don't expect renewables to take an increasing share on a global basis. It's just we have a very large amount of coal-fired generation right now that is ripe. It's low-hanging fruit for a switch to other fuels, whether that's nuclear, hydro. Primarily, in many cases, we have unused natural gas-fired generation that could have a higher utilization rate that could conceivably displace coal in the mix. And much of the reason that we've seen coal being displaced here in the United States is because of low natural gas prices, because of this increase in shale and tight natural gas and the increase in U.S. tight oil supplies and the associated natural gas that comes from it. So over the next several years, we're going to see U.S. LNG exports also rise from about 5% of the total amount of LNG that's exported up to around 15% by the time we get to 2040. And every single one of those molecules of natural gas that's coming from here in the United States is arguably going to displace a coal-fired electron that is being generated in some other country. So the problem with energy transitions is that they are hard. We've seen it took 45 years for oil to get from 1% to 10% of the mix. It took something similar, 40 to 50 years for natural gas to get to that same amount. When you look at renewables, we're only at about 6% of global energy is satisfied by renewables, and we've only been 10 years in. So energy transitions are hard. When you look at the share of total energy, it's shifted. We've seen shifts in what that mix is, but over time we just continue to demand more and more energy. So each one of these new fuels is taking some of that slice of incremental demand. So now not only do we need to meet incremental demand with some new set of fuels, but we also have to decarbonize the existing mix, and that's really hard. So the lowest cost way to do that arguably is via natural gas and other fuels that are available. So I want to maybe just conclude with that comment, and I'm happy to come back to the issues of transport and the power sector in our Q&A.
Thank you. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate taking the U.S. experience and putting it in a global context. And then I think that fits well, actually, with kind of going back to the U.S. for a moment and thinking about what we're offering to the global energy marketplace and then what that means in terms of jobs here at home. So I think for the first topic I'd like to explore with all of you is a little deeper dive. I mentioned that 3.5 million workers throughout the U.S. are employed in the U.S. clean energy industries. And again, I think that is a very conservative figure. But tell me a little bit about what that looks like from your industry vantage point. And maybe, Mike, we can start with you. And also, I would just say, too, let's talk a little bit about what some of the challenges might be going forward. So, we need to maintain and grow that workforce.
Right. So let me clarify first that the sector of the propane industry that we represent is the one for and typically the end use application. So there's another sector of the industry, of the petrochemical sector. So those companies that use propane as a feedstock to make other products, plastics and whatnot. That segment of the industry is represented by another association, so we don't really get involved in that segment of the industry. In the retail industry for propane, we have about 57,000 employees. And probably the largest percentage of employees in our industry are going to be drivers, truck drivers, and field service technicians. Any industry out there that relies on trucking in any form or fashion will tell you that there is a shortage of truck drivers out there. And our industry is no different. So we're basically engaging in efforts to try to increase our workforce, look for, bring newer, younger people into the industry, and certainly with a focus on adding more truck drivers. One of the challenges for our industry is that propane is a hazardous material, so we're highly regulated by a number of federal agencies. And so one of them being as a truck driver, in addition to getting your CDL, you'll have to go through and get your hazmat endorsement. And so, when you're competing with other non-hazmat industries, that sometimes plays is a factor as well. But one of the things unique about propane is that we're pretty much everywhere. And so in rural settings, as I said, beyond where natural gas infrastructure typically exists. So the uniqueness of that is for people who are looking for jobs and think that they have to leave their small town and go to a big city to get a job. It's not necessarily the case with our industry because we're everywhere. We have storage facilities in many locations, and so we present an opportunity for people to stay in their hometown or to get employment there. So those are some characteristics of the industry. Some specific things that we are doing as an association to try to increase our workforce and attract more people. NPJ has been working with the Department of Labor to get a nationally approved registered apprenticeship program. So obviously the nature of an apprenticeship program is that the apprentice receives on-the-job learning as well as job-related instruction or training. Our industry has a training curriculum that's been in place for well over 20 years, and we've expanded it, and it's significant. And we're literally, I think, days away from receiving final approval from the Department of Labor on that. One of the values of getting a nationally recognized program and approval from DOL is that the apprentice will get a credential, and any apprentice or any employee or employer looking to use people who have gone through this program will acknowledge and recognize that there's been a formal training program that these individuals have gone through. And it's also a value to technical schools and trade schools who are looking for programs that they can simply plug into their core curriculum, if you will. So if we've got a program that is approved at the national level, it makes it much easier for them to just drop it right into their curriculum, and it just makes it easier for them to implement. And there are also grant opportunities that may be available at the state or local level as well. Two other things we're doing, we're looking to form partnership. We have formed partnerships with groups like the National Association of Workforce Boards, which were developed, I think it was the Workforce Investment Act of 1998 that called for the development of these types of workforce boards. These boards basically consist of community leaders who are appointed by the local elected officials, and they're charged with identifying priorities, high growth industries in their local area and working to develop them and working with local businesses and reinvesting back into that. So most states will have multiple workforce boards, and depending on the size of the state, you could have dozens of workforce boards. So we're excited about that. And then lastly, I'll just say that we've also worked with a group called Vets to Techs. That is an organization that's looking to connect military veterans who are transitioning from active service back home, in finding opportunities for them to work in the manufacturing and technical sector. And for us, that would mean, new drivers and new technicians. And so obviously it's a great program. And so there's some other things that we're doing as well with some other organizations, but those are some of the things that we're doing.
Well, that was very comprehensive, and just knowing my conversations with Business Council for Sustainable Energy members about the workforce initiatives they have. You touched on many of the key components, especially outreach with veterans, working with local governments, apprenticeship programs. I mean, some of the statistics across the industry are quite staggering in terms of the workforce opportunities and the needs given retirement of workers in both the power sector and the energy sector as a whole. I saw a lot of heads nodding. I would say if there's any brief comments on that topic, we'll take them. Otherwise, we'll go to another discussion. Hayes,
So
please.
I'll just, the veterans piece is really important. When we talk about the tight labor market that we're in right now, being able to tap into additional skills that can translate with minimal training is really, really important. And there are certain states, from an offshore wind perspective, up and down the East Coast, that have a lot of transitioning veterans within their population, and the challenge is getting them upskilled quickly. But they already have a lot of the skills, but making sure that they are transitioning into these roles, because offshore wind, as we think about manufacturing, as we think about deploying, as we think about operation and maintenance technicians, we're going to be kind of battling with other industries to try and get some of those workers, get some of that talent into this industry that's just ramping up.
So
Any other quick
just
comments?
really,
Yes.
just really briefly, so this week we released our U.S. Economic Impact Report, and it highlighted that we employ roughly 14,000 people across the United States, but I think the more interesting thing is the multiplier effect of that. So over 200,000 people, though, via vendors and other suppliers, are employed through our various operations, both oil and gas and as well in the renewable energy space. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then a broader macro point, so going forward, much of the incremental oil demand is going to come from petrochemicals. We will see a peak for gasoline. We'll see at some point possibly a plateauing of diesel demand. But when you look out at the global landscape, petrochemical demand in the developing world is a major driver of growth in oil demand. And where is that going to be satisfied from? A lot of it will come from the U.S. Gulf Coast, because we have low cost petrochemical feedstock that will also take advantage of the shale light quality basins that we have here that are very well suited for that petrochemical demand growth. So I just want to make that macro point.
Yeah, go ahead, Malcolm.
One challenge that I think the industry faces that we really haven't focused on yet is motivating the new generation of workforce, getting them interested. Both of my daughters are in a STEM high school program, and they are really excited about designing drones and the latest smartphone app, and the electricity sector is not on their radar screen. Even though there's classes on it in their school, it's not hot and sexy the way it needs to be. And I could share that the hydro industry, heavy STEM-focused engineering workforce, this is a challenge. And so we're actively trying to do hackathons at our conferences and other things in order to get high school and college students interested and exposed to this industry that isn't on their radar screen. So I think there's a lot more that the clean energy sector needs to do in that space.
Yeah, and just to wrap up this topic, and we could spend a whole session just on this topic, but I want to acknowledge leadership in the U.S. energy industry, spearheaded by Abby Hopper, the CEO of SEIA, who we heard via video conference a few moments ago. SEIA, under her leadership, embarked on a very aggressive inclusion and diversity effort for her industry, but then she reached out to many other aspects of the U.S. energy sectors and is partnering, and I think it's really inspiring. So in addition to, maybe the things that people think about first of mind, how are we going to fill jobs when people are retiring? How do we encourage more young engineers and others to think about energy as an exciting place to work? We also need to be enhancing the diversity and making sure that our industries are inclusive. So that is something that I'm really proud to know that she's doing and want to support her in that. So I'm going to flip for a moment. You know, a few of you talked about either new areas that you're looking out towards, opportunities for growth or expansion. So I want to hear a little bit about that, but I think I want to pair it with, you know, what might be the opportunities and barriers to achieving these, you know, new opportunities in the industries you work in. So, you know, Hayes, maybe I'll start with you, and you know, anything you want. What are you looking out at, and you know, any challenges or barriers in the way to making that promise come to fruition?
Yeah, there are always challenges and barriers, right? But there are also opportunities.
Right.
There are a couple of challenges in the U.S., particularly as the offshore wind industry begins to ramp up and looks to create that first wave of deployment. First and foremost, it's certainty of market. We are very capital intensive, long lead time projects. And what we are looking for to make investments is certainty that we will be able to at least compete for opportunities to deploy our products. And so in doing that, the U.S. has really stepped up over the last 3 to 4 years, the Northeast particularly, creating these clean energy renewable mandates that include offshore wind as a meaningful part of it. I mean, New York has a 9,000 megawatt goal by 2035. Massachusetts was the first one to step up with the first big goal of 1,600 megawatts by 2027 that's subsequently been doubled. And so that was a big initial barrier, but maintaining that pipeline and ensuring that the industry writ large, as I talked about the tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, they know that this will be around for a long time, and they start making their investments in building up manufacturing, building up a cluster for the industry that allows the tier 2, tier 3 suppliers to be successful. So that's one where continuing that growth signal is important for the market. Another one is a challenge, and I won't get into it too deep, is just the ability to actually utilize vessels that have been built globally for this type of for this industry. There are challenges that the industry faces with the Jones Act, and so the focus on our industry is trying to create Jones Act compliant vessels that are U.S. flagged, U.S. manned, U.S. built, U.S. owned, that can handle a lot of the stuff that the U.S. is just not used to, particularly the jack-up vessels. But those are challenges that with any business, you understand what the landscape is, and you try and work towards finding creative solutions towards, and I think the industry as a whole has done a good job for that. The last one, and I'll just circle back, is workforce. Being able to train the workforce. There's always this chicken or the egg issue with workforce development. You don't want to train people too soon that they turn around and take those skills and go somewhere else. But you don't want to be too late to the game and train people that aren't going to have a job. And so right-sizing how you train people and how you get them prepared for an industry that is on the cusp of happening is a challenge, but it's one that we and other developers are working very closely with the states who are really pushing on this to try and create customized solutions that can turn out quickly workers to have the skills they need to be successful, and give us as developers the skills that we need to cost-effectively deploy our projects.
Thank you. Malcolm, I think I'll go to you next.
Thanks. There are a lot of new technologies and successes in the hydropower and marine energy space. So whether it's fish-friendly turbines or low head flow hydro or wave or tidal technologies, it's really exciting, the new developments. One of the successes that I think is tremendous that I wasn't aware of, we heard from Senator Collins of Maine last night. Penobscot, I'm not sure if it's River Basin, I believe, they were able to deploy some of these new technologies, do upgrades at existing facilities, and remove a bunch of other dams. So as part of a river basin restoration project, they were able to pay for the dam removals and the fish restoration by upgrading the existing facilities and overall without losing any electrical generation. So I think looking at those opportunities for win-wins, for growth for the industry and using the new technologies for growth for the environment is incredibly exciting. The three barriers, or maybe opportunities to drive further growth, first is the permitting process. It is dysfunctional to say the least, and it's a structural dysfunction. You've got federal permits, state permits. When they don't agree, there's no mechanism for resolution, and so you've got dozens and dozens and dozens of permits that simply get renewed year after year after year because there's no mechanism to resolve the dispute. And permits go on for decades, multiple decades, and we're missing opportunities to drive environmental improvement and upgrades at the facilities. So we've somehow got to figure out how to create a resolution to that system. Second opportunity is the way we monetize clean energy. There's a lot of attributes that are not currently paid for. And I think hydropower, particularly pumped storage, is incredibly well positioned to provide those attributes and value to the grid, whether it's flexible response and being able to respond quickly, or black start, or voltage support, a whole host of services that they're not paid for, and that creates a disincentive to investment. And that has to, if we're going to get to deep decarbonization, we have to figure out a way to monetize the system, what the attributes that the system needs. And the last one, I'd be remiss if I didn't say carbon. The lack of carbon pricing is obviously a disincentive to further investment in this area. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Love to come back to some of those topics, but Mike, I want to talk a little bit about, well, the two Mikes, Michael and Mike.
Notice we sat on opposite sides to make it easier for you.
We were talking a little bit in preparation for this about electric vehicles and sustainable transportation. We haven't really talked very much about that on the panel yet. Maybe you might say a few words,
Sure.
and then Mike, if you had any further comments on transportation issues from Propane's perspective. But
Sure. So, again, just generally in terms of our outlook, we expect right now electric vehicles account for less than 0.5% of the total amount of vehicles on the road globally. So 0.4% of the vehicles on the road. That said, we've of course seen very rapid uptake in places like Norway. We've seen rapid uptake in terms of sales in California and certain other states in this country, but it's not enough. We're starting from a very, very low base. So in our projections, in our base case, we see electric vehicles accounting for roughly 15% of the total car park, so the total number of cars on the road by 2040. In a case where we have to get in line with Paris, so in a case where we see 45% reduction in CO2 emissions from where we are right now, that share only goes up from about 15% to about 30%. So the point I want to make here that I think is really relevant is that, again, the low-hanging fruit is not in the transport sector. So when you look at the way in which we get from 36 or 38 or so gigatons of CO2 down to about 18 gigatons of CO2 by the time, switching from that base case scenario to a rapid transition scenario, only 10% of that abatement is coming from the transport sector. And that's because it costs so much to do it. And so much of that abatement is coming from the power sector, at least in our modeling. And we're not alone in that. So I think that creates an issue. So there's cost, convenience, consumer awareness. Those are all barriers to higher EV adoption. We are trying, we've thrown the kitchen sink at those transport forecasts to try to see just what the landscape will look like by 2040, and we don't get a massive reduction in fuel consumed by 2040 from a high EV penetration. What you do get is a very high reduction in fuel consumed from efficiency measures, from the hybridization of the drivetrain. That's where you get the real savings in terms of fuel, and as a result, you get a reduction in emissions as well.
any comments?
So, well, really, obviously, from a propane perspective, propane is actually the third most used vehicle fuel in the world, behind gasoline and diesel. Here in the U.S., for the propane vehicle market, our area is really focused primarily on the light duty and medium duty side, more so than the heavy duty side. And one area I think is really important that we're really excited about is the use of propane in school buses. We've seen 96% reduction in NOx emissions using propane buses compared to model year equivalent diesel buses. And we've been able to work with states to take advantage of the VW settlement that from a few years ago, where states were awarded, I think it was $2.7 billion to allocate to those states to help with the environment. And so propane school buses are in 900 school districts throughout the country, 47 states. We say 1 million students are transported every day on these buses. And there was a recent Georgia State University study that actually talked about the health impacts for children riding on dirtier buses. And rather than looking at the environmental impact, they were looking at the impact on the children. And it was the first time there was a correlated impact to diminished school or academic performance. And so it provided the impetus for the state of Georgia to allocate up to $2 million to purchase alternative fueled school buses. So I know in that state, 17 school districts have already purchased over 150 propane school buses. And so, I think from a vehicle standpoint, that's probably where we're the most excited right now with the deployment and increased deployment of propane school buses throughout the U.S.
Well, we're going to get towards the end of the panel here, and I think I wanted to close with kind of a vision-y kind of question. If we're sitting here 10 years from now, again, around the theme of clean energy and what it's doing for our economy and what we're offering to the global marketplace, what would be a wish or a desire you'd like to be able to report on 10 years from now? And I realize, I don't know who wants to start first, but go ahead.
So I think there's a real challenge that we face in terms of seeing a higher penetration of natural gas in the broader power mix, and that relates to methane leakage. And so I think one of the areas that we have to be focused on and we are focused on, is how to reduce that. And then part of the associations that we're in are focused on specific targets around methane intensity. So in 10 years' time, I would hope that we're talking a lot about hydrogen, right? We're talking about ways in which we can dramatically decarbonize the broader energy system. And in order to do that, there needs to be more research and more innovation in bringing on various sources of hydrogen into the economy that can really solve quickly the problem that we are facing.
Thank you.
Yeah, just in 10 years, the hope is that the offshore wind, that the U.S. market is the largest growth market for offshore wind globally. And that has the potential to create a lot of innovation being exported to other markets from an offshore wind standpoint globally. When we think about moving from East Coast to potentially West Coast, you need floating technology in order to actually have offshore wind scalable. And so that is a potential big opportunity. You've got kind of a big user or desired user of clean energy on the West Coast, California, and so they have not tapped into offshore wind. So over the next 10 years, and in 10 years' time, the hope is that the U.S. market becomes a large market that is exporting innovation instead of just kind of continuing to absorb what Europe has done over the last 15 years.
In my quick 10 seconds, in 10 years, I hope that we've been able to take all the amazing R&D that currently is being done around the country and get it deployed. Whether it's offshore wind or propane or other technologies, we need to deploy what we've already got. And in order to do that, I think it's going to be fundamental economics are going to drive it. And right now, we kid ourselves if we think the energy markets and electricity markets work. They distort the market in a variety of ways. So I'm hoping that in 10 years, we're able to get those market signals work to value these technologies that we've refined, and then we'll be able to export them around the world.
Me, finally.
Yes.
With 10 seconds left. I would be very encouraged at the greater use of renewable propane. So renewable propane is available today. Production capacity is about 100 million gallons a year, but it's growing. And I think when you look at what's happening at the state level with many states adopting renewable portfolio standards and the incentives that are available for renewables, I would be very encouraged if we're a major player in that arena.
Well, all very exciting. I hope to be with you here in 10 years so we can report on all of that. And I just want to thank, again, National Clean Energy Week for the opportunity to bring this panel and this discussion to you all. And just let's give them a very warm welcome. Thank you.